I'll call the, what is it, Thursday, November 16th meeting of the Legislative Coordinating Commission to order. And we'll start, I believe there's probably agendas in the back. We'll start with review and approval of the minutes from the June 2nd, 2017 meeting. They are in your packet, I believe. They are not in my packet. Oh, that is it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I do have it. Representative Pepin moves approval of the minutes from the June 2nd meeting. Discussion on that motion? Or any questions about the minutes? Hearing no discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The motion prevails. Next on the agenda, item 2 is update on the legislative appropriations, and we'll start with Mr. Cal Ludeman, the Secretary of the Senate. Mr. Ludeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the LCC. Appreciate it if I may call it the LCC. Thank you for the opportunity this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about the status of the appropriations relative to the veto, but it's not appropriations anymore, about the financial setting of the state Senate. Of course, as you know, both the House and the Senate are operating on what is called the carry forward, which is the savings that have accumulated over some time, and we are living on the short end of that carry forward, and that's the message that I will convey to you today. Senate rules assigned me the administrative duties of the Senate operations, which includes the fiscal operations. That is a reason for the affidavits and some of the filings that appeared in the court. Why I was the sponsor of something. Oh, okay.
Better.
I'm not going to start over if that's all right.
No, you're fine.
But that is a lot of the explanation of what I'm going to say. So a very quick review, if I may, about sort of the velocity of the events since May 30th would be helpful, because it explains a little bit of the changes in some of the filings and affidavits that exist, but the numbers have been fairly consistent throughout. And I will do this very quickly and get to the final line about some dates of when the Senate would be shutting down short of any other action. It will reveal the Senate finances that have been consistently reported to the courts and in different forms by myself, but particularly by Senator Gazelka, even to the public, about the status of federal Senate fiscal conditions. The governor vetoed the legislative appropriation on May 30th. The legislature, with the help of this body, filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality and other issues of the veto. Filings were made to the district court, and you can see some of those filings in your packets today that give the basic information of the Senate financial status that remains consistent in those filings as found in the affidavits. During the court proceedings, a stipulated agreement, as you know, was reached between the parties and ordered by the court that established a fractional budget based on our 2017 budget. And that was renewed at one time, even during that proceeding, to take us to October 1st. So from October 1st, we were still spending out of a budget called the fractional budget, which was 1/12 of our annual appropriation. That wasn't as easy as we thought. We had a little confusion between us and the Minnesota Management and Budget, and even the calculation of what is our carry forward, finding that they had not entered some of their SWIFT transactions. SWIFT is a software, but the transactions, and so at one time we were underreporting our carry forward, and then even by their admission and their filing with the Supreme Court, they overestimated our carry forward, but we finally settled on a real number, which was about $5.5 million of carry forward after July 1st of 2017. That agreement, as I said, was extended to October 1. It also called for a request for the expedited hearing before the Supreme Court should one party or the other make an appeal to the Supreme Court, which, as you well know, has happened. Before, during, and after those court proceedings, the Senate began steps to contain cost as practical to maintain the basic function of the state Senate. And so we started to do certain things. Senator Gazelka imposed a hiring freeze on June 27th. And so there has been a hiring freeze with some waiver capacity, but it's been held pretty firm. And we now have 12 vacancies that are not getting compensation because they are not any longer employees of the Senate. There are other savings things that we have done to try to pull ourselves in to sustain the Senate operations, even using the carry-forward funds as long as possible without jeopardizing the constitutional function of the state Senate. The filings were prepared as to the Senate finances, again, consistent with it, now using first that higher amount of the carry-forward, which was over $6 million, and then with MMB's adjustment and admission that they had not calculated some of those transactions that took place actually as early as May. In their reconciliation process, they discovered some of those corrections. Without a ruling from the Supreme Court, new filings were held and submitted to the Supreme Court, and that last filing to the district court revealed to Senator Gazelka certainly a more urgent snapshot of the status of Senate finances. In summary, it means that, and I should say this, in the transition between the fractional budget and the complete use of the carry forward, there was a bit of a transition with Senator Gazelka making a successful negotiation about the use of a one building payment. We'll talk about the building maybe a little bit too, which constitutes 1/4 of the Senate budget. That October payment was able to be made from the fractional budget, not the carry forward, as well as a one Senate payroll on October 1st. We actually implemented the day before to take it out of the fractional reserve, and that was an agreement with even MMB to allow that to happen. So I can say that since October 2nd, we have been living on the carry forward. That also says that the exhaustion of the carry forward funds is at a fairly rapid rate. We've always said that our normal course of action is about a $2.5 million expenditure per month. It's less than that because of some of the restrictions that we put on some spending. Not only did Senator Gazelka impose a hiring freeze, but he also suspended all payments for senators for per diem, travel, mileage, communications, many of the other reimbursements that were a normal course of business. With that said, even with that said, we'll be out of funds, causing a furlough of all Senate employees on December 1st. There will be a little bit of money left over to actually make that 2-week payroll in the middle of December, and then the Senate is out of business, and we would be shut down.
Mr. Ludeman, if I could interrupt just for a second, does that number include making the debt payment on the Senate building? And if it does, if you didn't make that payment, would that allow your funds to last longer, and if so, how much longer?
Well, in this scenario, if nothing changes, Mr. Chairman, we would not be able to make the December payment for the building, and that would be approximately one payroll. So we would probably have approximately 2 weeks, probably 2 weeks of extension. I am here today based on some thought that perhaps the transfer of LCC carry forward could be implemented as well. But that payment is due every month. So the building payment, I'm talking about the lease, the maintenance, and the parking garage debt service, it's called, and that's $669,333 per month. But a payroll, for staff payroll, is approximately $595,000 every 2 weeks. Part of the problem that we have going forward is that December, I know this is a little different than the House of Representatives, we have a 2-week payroll period, and so December happens to be one of the 2 months of the year where there are 3 payrolls in December, and so the exhaustion of the carry forward, no matter what we do with an issue like that, would still close us down middle of December.
I think Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Ludeman. I'm a little unclear about that. Could you just be more clear, if you did not make the December payment, how long would you be able to employ your staff versus if you did make the December payment? I'm trying to get an understanding of if you stopped paying rental payments, right, no more rental payments, how long could you pay staff and all the other bills that the Senate has?
But we're not making a payment. I'm sorry, I misspoke. No, the plan, the December 1st date was based on not making the December payment. So the December 1st date holds. So we would not be making the December payment because we would be out of funds. Even though the invoice for that comes to us in the early part of the month, we would usually pay it toward the middle of the month, and we would have exhausted all funds. So I misspoke. It's worth one payroll, but we were not making that payment.
Representative Pepin.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ludeman. So no payroll and no payment of rent in December? I just want to be clear on the exact, on the
Paying
date.
one payroll, but furloughed as of December 1st.
And that includes
No
no
work.
rental payment?
That's correct.
Thank you.
And then Representative Carlson, did you have a question?
Sure.
Representative Carlson.
Mr. Chair, I have a little clarification on these payments. I was under the understanding if you made the December 1st payment, that the next one wasn't due until something like June. Where does that confusion
The
come
confusion,
in? And then you're talking about a monthly payment, so it leaves me a little confused as to just how that payment process works.
Representative, it's kind of a 3-step process. We are the renters of the building. We pay every month. We pay to the Department of Administration. They then they make a payment to MMB to pay the certificate holders, the actual certificates of indebtedness.
So, Mr. Chairman, then they basically collect your monthly payment, and then in June, they would make the payment on the bonds. Is that a fair way
I
to?
don't know the exact dates of when they pay those bonds.
But sometime in the future, they don't pay for the bonds every month, then, Mr. Chairman, is what I
No.
think I'm hearing.
They do not.
So
We do, though.
I'm just trying to figure out when we would be in potential default if payments weren't made, but if it's MMB collecting the money, and then they pay the bonds in 6 months out, or whatever that date is, that's a little different question than going into default on December 1st, because it's just MMB collecting the rent.
Senator
Shouldn't say
Gazelka.
just, that's important, but
I think Senator Gazelka would like to weigh in.
Okay.
Senator Gazelka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative. So the Senate has made their November payment, and with the resources that we have paid in, they can make their twice-a-year payment. One is in December, I think the other one's in May. But they will be able to make the December payment, so they won't be in default. So,
Okay.
but as the Secretary mentioned, we calculated December 1 is our furlough date. We can't make a December payment. The paycheck that comes 2 weeks later, we can pay, but furlough notices are December 1.
And Mr. Chairman,
Representative
Senator Gazelka, I just wanted clarification on when the bond payments were due, and that's where the monthly payment versus bond payments came into play. Thank you.
Mr. Ludeman.
Mr. Chairman, part of the reason I'm here is also to make I don't want to presume anything, but if the question, and some of the reasons we're here, is the potential use of the LCC carry forward, I don't know if you would like at this time some information about what impact that would have at this time or not.
I think that's appropriate, yeah.
But we did our calculations based on approximately a $3.5 million transfer of the LCC carry forward to the state senate. Just as an example, I guess we'll say this is what that would do. That would extend that December 1st date as far as January 12th. So January 12th would be the last day of all Senate employees. We would extend one employer paid health insurance through the month of February, but senators wouldn't get paid in February. No one would get paid in February. We would be out of money. With the last actual transaction taking place 2 weeks after January 12th to finally finish up the payroll.
If I can, Mr. Ludeman, just on the same subject that we just talked about, would you, if the LCC did authorize, would it be your intent to use some of that money to make the building payment?
That is what that calculation,
So that number you just gave us includes
yes.
making the payments on the building through that time as well. Can you tell me which months? So it would be likely December and January?
Yes, December and January.
2 payments?
2 additional payments of the lease under that scenario.
Okay. Any other information that you want to provide to us?
The only thing I would like to say, Mr. Chairman, is that the effect in diminishing the potential of the functionality of the Senate has already been felt. So to be able to recruit anybody or have any conversation about people that would like to come work for the Senate have been greatly affected, as well as current staff are starting to believe that the instability or the uncertainty of funding of the Senate may not make this the best possible place to work. Now, so we have legislators and leaders and courts and lawyers involved in all of this decision-making that could certainly clear this up. But we had an expectation of an appropriation that simply didn't happen.
I think Senator Fishbach has a question.
And these are on.
Senator Fishbach, it is. Yep.
Mr. Chair, Secretary Ludeman, if we don't make those payments in December and January, how far would that get us in payroll then? Because you said, I was trying to jot it down, but you said each payment gets us 1 payroll. So we would be able to, if you said January 1 with the payments, it would be February without the payments. Am I ballparking that?
It would be, well, I mean, we're talking about approximately $1.3 million that would be available. Now, that includes the transfer of the LCC funding as well. But if that was not used for those lease payments, we would probably be able to get us into the first week of February. But then also causing a furlough, a shutdown of Senate operations with barely enough to make us functional should a February 20th session actually take place with the skinniest crew possible. But that, I would say, the very first week of February.
I think maybe before we go too much further into the discussion on the potential of using the carry forward funds, we have an agenda item number 3 to deal with that. Maybe we can bring up some of those questions at that time. Does anyone have questions for Mr. Ludeman now? And then also, just as a point of information, to let you know what our intent here is, the Supreme Court has noticed us that they are going to issue a decision on the case, this issue that's before them, at 10 o'clock. I think we will finish, or try to finish, item 2 on the agenda. We will then recess shortly before 10 o'clock, and then we will reconvene after that decision comes out. And take action on number 3 if it's necessary based on what the court has decided. And then I think, as a point of information, we will make ourselves available to the press immediately after that. So Let's move on with item number 2. Next is Mr. Hubinger.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. I'm Greg Hubinger with the Legislative Coordinating Commission. Secretary Ludeman has indicated the status of the Senate's budget and when its carry-forward funds will be exhausted. We understand, I believe, that the House carry-forward budget is a little bit larger and will allow the House to continue operations until about February. The governor's court filings indicate that there really isn't an immediate shortage of funding. They point out that besides the House and Senate carry-forwards, there is the LCC carry-forward. There's also the LCC FY18 and FY19 appropriations. And they contend that that $45 million is available to support the work of the House and the Senate. The governor's filing ignores that the legislature appropriates funds to the LCC for staff and services that support and are fundamentally supportive of the work of the legislature that directly help the House and Senate in carrying out their constitutional duties. The immediate impact of using our FY18 and 19 appropriations, as suggested by the governor's court filing, would be for the LCC to have to lay off its 140 staff, those who are employed by the statutorily established commissions, the Office of the Legislative Auditor, the Reviser of Statutes, and the Legislative Reference Library. If the enacted appropriations were not available to the joint legislative offices, there would be numerous adverse impacts on the work of the legislature, and I'd like to highlight just a few of those. The LCC Subcommittee on Employee Relations reviews and considers interim approval of collective bargaining agreements with the state's 50,000 employees. Without staff and funding, the subcommittee would be unable to conduct this review of labor contracts that total some $8 billion in wages and benefits. Under current law, these collective bargaining agreements would become effective without legislative review and approval. The Legislative Commission on Pensions and Retirement oversees a public pension system covering nearly 1 million current and former employees who depend on the state's public pension plans to support their retirement. Approximately $70 billion has been set aside to pay for these benefits, but that amount is short of the fully funded accrued benefits by at least $30 billion. It is up to the Pensions Commission and the legislature to take action to shore up these pension systems and ensure that they remain solvent. Without funding, the Pensions Commission cannot do that work. The Legislative Commission on Data Practices conducts in-depth hearings on significant data practices and privacy policy issues, including student educational records, law enforcement technologies such as body cameras and automated license plate readers, internet privacy, and cybersecurity. These hearings inform the members as they develop their proposed legislation. Without funding, the commission cannot do its work. The Legislative Water Commission reviews water policy reports and recommendations from state agencies and conducts in-depth examinations of key water policy issues. Approximately 7% of the bills that were introduced during the 17th session related to water, a vital, complex, controversial, and costly topic. Commission members use this knowledge in developing policy proposals and considering appropriations related to water. The Legislative Budget Office that was newly established during the 17th session is responsible for managing the fiscal note tracking system, which tracks fiscal impacts of proposed legislation. Without funding, this core function cannot be carried out. The executive and legislative branches would not be able to determine if the biennial state budget is in balance or not. The Legislative Reference Library supports the research and information needs of the legislature by providing in-depth background information, literature reviews, and interlibrary loan services to legislators and staff in 6 legislative research offices. The Program Evaluation Division of the Office of the Legislative Auditor depends on the library's staff and resources. More than 20 different legislative commissions and councils and task forces for which the LCC provides administrative and staffing support would not be able to accomplish the wide variety of missions that have been established in statute or session law. If appropriations to the LCC are transferred to the House and Senate, the work of these groups in reviewing state laws and policies and programs and making recommendations to the full legislature would cease. The LCC establishes and manages contracts that provide for transparency of the legislature's proceedings. It contracts to provide television coverage of House and Senate floor sessions and committee meetings. This enables state citizens to monitor and be informed about the legislative process. Without funding, the staffing and resources for this contract would not be available. The LCC also establishes and manages contracts that provide accessibility to the legislature's proceedings. We contract to provide captioning for television coverage and webcasts of House and Senate floor sessions and committee meetings, which enables all Minnesotans to monitor and be informed about the legislative process. We also contract for sign language interpreters so that citizens who are deaf or hard of hearing can fully participate in the legislative process. Without funding, the staffing and resources for these contracts would also not be available. Mr. Chair and members, these are some of the impacts of transferring the LCC's funds to the House and Senate would have on the LCC. Would be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Hubinger? Senator Gazelka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one comment for everyone, that you are a nonpartisan staff, not Democrat or Republican, and so the advice you're giving is really neutral. You're just saying what the impacts are, as are the next couple of testifiers.
Any further questions for Mr. Hubinger? Seeing none. Very good, thank you. Next is Mr. Marinack, the reviser of statutes. Mr. Marinack.
Mr. Chairman, members, good morning. My name's Paul Marinack. I'm the reviser of statutes. In your packet, you have an affidavit that I prepared for the lawsuit. I'm going to briefly summarize some of those points. As Mr. Hubinger did, I'd like to take a few moments to share the consequences that I see if the suggestion by the Governor's Council that not only carry forward is taken, but operating funds in 18 and 19 be accessed, what impact that would have not only the revisor's office, but the critical work that we support for you. The Office of the Reviser of Statutes has a complement of 59 highly trained attorneys, legal editors, computer professionals, and support staff. The action suggested by Governor Dayton's council to take the operating and carry forward funds of this office would require the layoff of these employees and the ceasing of all the critical support we provide the legislature, constitutional officers, departments and agencies, and the public. This action would significantly impact the lives of these employees, and that's certainly the greatest harm that comes from this. It's not a harm that's unique to us. That's going to be shared with all legislative employees. I believe that it's also likely that we wouldn't be able to rehire some of these people if they were laid off. As I said, they do very highly specialized work. So hiring and training replacements would be a significant challenge in the short term and would negatively affect the quality of support our office provides to you. Since 1939, one of the principal functions of the reviser is the duty to compile and maintain the official body of statutory law for the state. You rely on access to this body of law to discharge your primary constitutional duty, to make law. Unless you have access to that official law, you can't do that. The reviser makes sure that this official body of law is accurate, complete, secure, and easily accessible to the public. In 1939, we performed this function with ink and paper. These days, we do it with ones and zeros. We do it with highly specialized computer hardware and software that we purchase and maintain for that purpose. We not only use some of our operating funds for that, but also our carry forward. Without continued funding, we'll not be able to provide that critical service. Since 1947, we've also been a legislative drafting office for the Minnesota legislature. We provide essential drafting support to the legislature and are responsible for creating or reviewing and approving legislative documents such as bill drafts, amendments, House committee reports, House and Senate engrossments, House and Senate desk comparisons, side-by-side comparisons, conference committee reports, and enrollments. We've brought a high level of automation to the procedure used to create and modify these documents. Without continued funding, we won't be able to maintain or enhance that level of automation. As a consequence, the time savings and error reduction this automation has produced will be lost. The reviser also provides bill drafting services to all constitutional officers, all departments and agencies. In addition, we have administrative rule drafting and publication duties that we provide all executive departments and agencies. The State Administrative Procedure Act provides that no agency decision to adopt a rule is effective until the reviser approves it as to form. Without the reviser's support and assistance in this, departments and agencies would not be able to carry out this rulemaking function. The reviser also compiles the permanent compilation of administrative rules. The public access concerns that I have with regard to statutes and laws applies equally for this legal material as well. The reviser, under the supervision of the Chief Clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate, engrosses and enrolls all legislation. As the enrolling clerk for the legislature, we prepare, check, and present all enrollments to the governor as required by the Minnesota Constitution. All information on these critical documents is made available by the reviser on the public's website. Denial of funding to the reviser would mean all support for these critical legislative duties would end. The office maintains critical information technology systems to support and directly directly support the work of the Minnesota House of Representatives, Minnesota Senate, and the Legislative Coordinating Commission. The core technologies include secure data center, network equipment, data storage devices, computer servers, a relational data management system, commercial software, custom software applications, and end-user devices such as phones, desktop computers, and printers. The system is combined to create a secure local area network for digital communication within and outside the Minnesota legislature. Desktop productivity software to support the critical drafting and publishing functions of the reviser. And public bill status systems for data entry and approval, public administrative rule status system for data entry and approval, and finally, the reviser's website. This is the main portal for public access to statutes, laws, and administrative rules. Maintenance of these systems will not be possible without continuing funding for the people and the equipment employed by the reviser to do this work. Any hardware or software failure means that the work being supported can no longer be done. Specifically to the use of our carryforward, as I said, the reviser uses carryforward to fund hardware and software purchases that span biennia, one or more biennia. Some of these purchases have to be made 3, 6, 10 years. And so what we've done is tried to manage a carry-forward balance from biennium to biennium, which would allow us to make these purchases. We've identified over $600,000 of purchases, IT purchases that we need to make and that we would contemplate making from our existing carry-forward. Obviously, we won't be able to do that. Be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Any questions for Mr. Marinac? Senator Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Marinac, just to clarify, executive departments would be impacted if the governor has told the court that the legislature has access to all the LCC money. So if we took all the LCC money, could you please reiterate how the executive branch would be impacted?
Mr. Chair, Senator
Marinac.
Benson, in two fundamental ways. You're all familiar with the executive branch bill drafting process. We prepare all legislation on behalf of departments and agencies. We're in that process right now. Obviously, that would be directly impacted. And as I said before, we're critical in the administrative rule drafting and publication process. We provide drafting assistance to the Department of Agencies, rule drafting assistance, and form approval of various documents. We provide similar drafting and publication duties to them that we do to the legislature. Those would absolutely be affected.
Senator Benson.
And Mr. Chair, just to follow Mr. Marinac, would us taking all the funding for the reviser have any impact on the legal system or the courts in the state of Minnesota?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Benson, it would have a dramatic impact. At the extreme, if we're no longer to provide public access to the law in our web portal, it has a dramatic effect on the public and the legal community. Not only do we provide access to the complete, accurate database of law, current law, but we have archives, digital archives of statutes, laws, and rules. Certainly statutes and laws to territorial time and the rules to the 1980 when we started taking over. So yes, that's the main way that the public gets information. Obviously, we provide it in a number of different formats. Behind you, you'll see the books. We still publish statutes, laws, and rules in books for people that don't have internet access. Obviously, we'd have to terminate those contracts also.
Are you finished, Senator Benson? Yep. Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Marinack, forgive me if I missed this in your testimony, but so we've been told that there's $3.5 million that the LCC has in carry forward. What do you have carry forward in addition to that, or what portion of that carry forward is assigned to the revisors?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pappas, we have carry forward roughly $1.5 million in carry forward. We typically don't have a carry forward that's that large. I was appointed reviser a little over a year ago, and this was my first budgeting process, so I was very, very careful in managing that. And as you know, we didn't know what our operating budgets were going to be until the end of the legislative session, and then when it became clear that there would be a special session, I put off quite a number of critical IT expenses. That's why I say tomorrow we could spend $600,000 on making those expenses. Those are expenses we would have incurred in the prior fiscal year, but I chose to delay those purchases until we knew what the financial picture was.
Senator Pappas.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Marinack, is the 1.5 million part of the 3.5 million, or in addition to the 3.5?
I believe it's,
Mr. Marinack.
Mr. Chair, Senator Pappas, I believe it's part of the 3.5 million. Mr. Hubinger.
Part of it.
No.
Then, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Pappas.
Then, Mr. Chairman, just a comment. If we do proceed with number 3, with borrow, I would like us to consider that a kind of a borrowing of the carry forward funds, because it does seem to me that there are legitimate purposes that those funds have been set aside for, and I hope the committee will strongly consider that.
Senator Dames.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you tell me, Mr. Marinack, how many people would you have to lay off if you did not receive your funding?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Daines, 59 people, lawyers, computer people, legal editors, and support staff.
Thank you.
The other thing I didn't mention, Mr. Chair, I didn't mention is we would have to terminate all the vendor agreements that we have for hardware and software. Obviously, we can do that. I would imagine, this is speculation on my part, the cost would increase in renegotiating those contracts. We have 2 long-term publishing contracts that I've extended for a period of 2 years at very favorable terms. I think if we break that contract and renegotiate it, we would be looking at long-term contracts for substantially more cost.
Right. Mr. Hubinger, did you want to comment on a previous question?
Mr. Chair, I may have missed some of the question, but the carry-forward balance in the revisor's office is captured in the overall carry-forward balance that the LCC has been presenting in the court filings. There's a gross balance of $3.8 million. We have obligations of about $500,000, so there's roughly $3.3 million available.
Okay. And did that satisfy your question, Senator
Yes, it did.
Pappas?
Thank you.
Okay. And then Representative Carlson?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, for both of you being a chair at the table, in your testimony, you've referenced contracts. And if you break those contracts, and I understand what was just said about renegotiating them, we might not get as favorable negotiations as we currently have, but are there fiscal impacts in effect when you break the contract? I mean, sometimes you have a liability if you break a contract in addition to what you might have to renegotiate. Is that true with either of you, with the various contracts you administer?
Mr. Hubinger.
Mr. Chair, Representative Carlson, our contracts generally have a provision that indicates that we're required to pay the contractor for any work that they've done up to the point of the breaking of the contract.
And is that true with the revisor's contracts as well?
Mr. Chair, Representative Carlson, most of the contracts we negotiate, we're very careful to make sure that we can back out of the contract without any financial hardship. I haven't had a chance to look at all the hardware and software contracts to see if there are liquidated damage provisions in there. There certainly would be an additional cost, as I said, if we had to renegotiate the contracts. A rent agreement, I believe we can get out of without a penalty. So I think those costs would be minimal. It would just be the impact going forward of having to renegotiate these contracts. And I'm sure there were vendors would be very cautious about renegotiating contracts with us without additional security.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay, any further questions? All right, then we'll move on to Mr. Nobles, the legislative auditor. Mr. Nobles, welcome, and please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, my name is Jim Nobles. I'm the legislative auditor, and with me at the table is Elizabeth Stawicki, legal counsel for the Office of the Legislative Auditor. Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, I think what you've heard today, I will sum up by saying Governor Dayton's veto has put the entire legislative branch, its functions, its staff, its members, at serious risk. And that's very disturbing. For me, that means we share an obligation, all of us together, members and staff, to protect and defend the legislative branch and support the legal challenge to the governor's veto. My primary responsibility is, of course, to defend the office of the legislative auditor. And in recent days, defending OLA has become a matter of some urgency, and for the reasons that you've already heard. Counsel for the governor recently told the court that the governor's veto did not shut down the legislature and was constitutional because the House and Senate can fund its operations in fiscal years 18 and 19 by taking money from OLA and the other joint commissions and offices. I think the council's statement to the court was extremely misleading and disturbing, and I felt a responsibility to respond to what the governor's position is, as stated through his counsel. And with assistance and advice from OLA's legal counsel, Elizabeth Stawicki, we submitted an affidavit to the court, and you have a copy. First, we said the governor's counsel did not accurately characterize and represent the law that allows the Legislative Coordinating Commission to transfer money from appropriations to the legislative branch. Second, we said that the governor's counsel did not inform the court of the harm that would be done if, in fact, the House and Senate are forced to fund their operations in fiscal 2018 and 19 from money appropriated to the joint offices and commissions, including to the Office of the Legislative Auditor. On the first point, the governor's counsel told the court that $45 million is available to the House and Senate from money the legislature appropriated to the joint offices and commissions. He failed to inform the court that the law is conditional. The law only authorizes the transfer of, quote, unobligated balances. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, unobligated in the context of funding means appropriations, appropriated money, but money that is remaining uncommitted by contract at the end of a fiscal year. And according to Black's Law Dictionary, obligation means to commit funds to meet obligations. And Mr. Chair and members, as legislative auditor, I have committed the funds that were appropriated to the Office of the Legislative Auditor for our operations in 2018 and 19. As others have said, we do have some carryover from the prior biennium and fiscal year. That amount is $280,000 and a little more of unobligated balance from the previous fiscal year. But on the other hand, as I said, I have obligated the appropriations to the Office of the Legislative Auditor for 2018 and 19 to personnel costs, to a lease for the space we occupy in the Centennial Building, and to various other service contracts that we need to fulfill our legally mandated responsibility. On the second point, we told the court that if funding for the House and Senate is not restored, and the legislature is forced to fund the House and Senate through the rest of the biennium with money appropriated to the Office of the Legislative Auditor, I will have to lay off 63 OLA staff. In addition to the hardship that this would cause individuals, shutting down OLA would undermine legislative oversight. It would damage the state's credit rating and put at risk the ability of the state to receive federal funds. Let me just elaborate on those 2 points. We are currently auditing the state's financial statements. That is an obligation we have by law. That is something the state depends on and is required to have to get a credit rating. If the money is taken from OLA and we do not perform that audit, it will have a serious impact on the state's credit rating. We also, under federal law and state law, are responsible for auditing the state's use of federal funds. We are currently doing that audit, and we would do that audit again next year. If we do not do that audit, the state's receipt of federal funds is in jeopardy. In fact, a year ago, Commissioner Franz wrote a letter to me that he released to the press, chastising the Office of the Legislative Auditor for potentially not meeting a deadline to submit a package to the federal government, including our audit work. We did meet that deadline. But his concern about us meeting that deadline led him to write a letter saying that the Office of the Legislative Auditor and Mr. Nobles is putting federal funds for the state of Minnesota at risk. So we are dealing with some very serious matters when the Governor's Council suggests that there's $45 million out there for the taking so that he can declare, and he hopes the court will declare, that his veto was constitutional because it did not shut down the legislature. I am talking about the worst case scenario, and I hope and I'm confident that you will not let that happen. But the fact that the governor and his council would put that forth is very disturbing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Wicki and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Senator Benson.
Thank you. Mr. Nobles, you perform the federal single audit function. Off the top of your head, do you know which of the executive departments has the most single audits?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Senator Benson, the Department of Human Services.
And so, Mr. Chair and Mr. Nobles, if those single audits for the Department of Human Services were not able to be performed because we followed the governor's recommendation and took the legislative auditor's money, it would significantly impact the federal funds we receive in the Department of Human Services.
Mr. Chair, Senator Benson, that is not only my opinion, that is Commissioner Franz's opinion as well.
Thank you, Mr. Nobles.
And Mr. Chair, because I wanted to be brief, I just want to refer you to the affidavit that Mr. Wicki and I submitted to the court. If you want to see a more detailed enumeration of the impact, I refer you to page 4 and 5. There's a long enumeration of the audits, the evaluations, the investigations that we have in process, and will continue into the next fiscal year. Just to highlight a couple, we plan on a major financial audit of MNLARS because of all of the upheaval and all of the problems that have occurred with MNLARS. So that's planned for the next year, and if we're not funded, that won't occur. We are also, as you know, been asked to audit managed care organizations, particularly with the help of Senator Benson. If we don't have funding, that won't happen. And I could go down the list. But I see you looking at the clock with some anxiety, Mr. Chair, so I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think at this point, the committee will recess to the call of the chair, and my intent is to come back at approximately 10:10. So committee stands in recess to the call of the chair until approximately 10:10.